Have someone hand out these for me. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Dan?
Thank you.
To talk about Hanukkah today, as this coming Sunday night, December 6th through Sunday, December 13th, we will be observing Hanukkah. We'll be here next Sunday night at 6 o'clock, dinner, lighting of the candles, and teaching, reading of scriptures. But I want to kind of give you a background on Hanukkah and kind of educate along the way, hopefully. I want you to go with me to John chapter 10. I want to focus on something really quick here, and we'll come back to this text as well. This is really cool. John chapter 10. I don't know if you noticed the phrase. It's used in verse 16. Phrase, they hear my voice. In verse 16 it says, other sheep I have which are not of this fold, them I must bring, and they will Shema B'Kol. In Hebrew, Shema B'Kol, they will hear my voice. And that phrase right there is used throughout the Hebrew scriptures to speak of hearing his voice with the idea of obedience. But he says, other sheep I have which are not of this fold. So this is the inclusion of Gentiles into the fold. So there's those who are already in the fold, the insiders, those of Jewish ethnicity, and then the outsiders, so to speak, those of these other sheep. And notice that they will hear his voice. See, because there'll be one flock and one shepherd. If you have one flock, you can still have multiple different types of sheep in that one flock. My mother-in-law has different types of sheep. You have Dorsets and Romneys in the same flock. They're all grouped together. And as the shepherd, she knows which ones are which. She can tell you which ones are the meat breed and which ones are the wool breed. And there's multiplicity of different types of sheep breeds. And yet they're all in one flock with one shepherd. And the shepherd leads that flock in unison as a group. And they have to hear his voice. So this notion that we can have two groups, one over here and one over here, and that they can hear different voices and be different flocks, goes in direct opposition to what this text is saying, which is, no, there will be different breeds of sheep. Yes, there are differences, to be sure. You have all kinds of breeds, but yet there's one flock, one shepherd, and they all must Shema B'Kol. They all must hear his voice. He goes on after verse 16. If you keep reading, we read all the way down. He says this. He says, verse 27, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. Shema B'Kol. All through to hear with a voice is used throughout the Hebrew scriptures to mean obedience to God's commandments. All the way through this. In fact, I believe it's in Genesis 26 that we looked at a couple weeks ago. Yes. Listen to verse 5, Genesis 26:5. He says, this is regarding and I wrote down John 10, 25 to 27. He says, this is regarding Abraham. This is Yahweh speaking. He says, I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven, and I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice. And that phrase right there is Shema B'Kol. He listened to my voice, or obeyed my voice. And that's paired with, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my Torah. So listening to his voice, hearing his voice, is not optional if you're one of his sheep. It's not as if we could say, well, some sheep get to hear his voice, and some sheep, well, they don't have to listen to him. They all must hear him, and they all must be obedient to him. And there's one flock and one shepherd, and he's not talking out of both sides of his mouth. This is where my brothers and sisters in the Messianic movement have gone awry, is that, well, there are Jews who are the true people of God, and the Gentiles, well, they're grafted in, but they hear a different voice. I hear him saying here, one flock, one shepherd, all must hear his voice.
Amen.
Not I get to hear one voice, and you get to hear another voice. You can hear him say one thing, I can hear him say another. He doesn't speak with a multiplicity of voices, he speaks with one voice. Which is interesting because I got many of my brothers and sisters they are my brothers and sisters who are going to hear the voice of Christmas this coming month. And I just don't hear that voice. Because I don't hear that voice in the text. So we have to say, okay, what voice have we been listening to? What shepherd have we been listening to? These are the kinds of questions that we'll have to continue asking. So I want to talk about Hanukkah in just a moment, but we'll get to that in just a second. Yes.
He says that his sheep know his voice and will follow him. They will not follow the way of a stranger.
Right.
So if there are those that are following the stranger, are they really his sheep?
That's a huge question. That's a big question. That's an inevitable question that comes from this. And the answer to that, I think, is in Matthew 7, where he says, many will come to me in that day and say, Lord, Lord,
right.
Did we not?
I never knew you.
I never knew you. That no there is covenantal. I was never in a covenantal relationship with you. Not that I didn't know about you. Of course I knew about you.
Yeah.
But I didn't know you in terms of a covenantal relationship where I was the suzerain and you were the vassal, where I was the shepherd and you were the sheep.
Even Satan knows Yeshua, and he trembles.
Right. Absolutely. And here's one of the things I think now I'm going to address this going into Hanukkah, because this goes to the issue of how we got to Hanukkah. The Syrian army comes down from the north, and prior to Syria coming down in 168 BC, we have what's called Hellenism. And Hellenism gave us theater, it gave us gymnasiums, it gave us philosophy, it gave us a lot of things. And the culture sucked into all of this stuff. And Hellenistic culture was very, very enticing. Who doesn't like a good play? Who doesn't like games? Who doesn't like philosophy? All of these things that Hellenism gave were cultural powerhouses. And we are still either benefiting or not benefiting from those today.
Yes, Brent. But after they gave them all those things, then they started to take away from them the things that they had that were righteous and godly.
Absolutely, that's what I'm
They
getting
were found with a Torah.
Right.
They were dead.
Right.
If you circumcised your child, you were dead.
Yes.
Now look at today. we're seeing what they're taking away from us today.
Absolutely. And they're doing the same thing. So he's right. What happened was the Syrians, basically in 167, they offered a pig. In 25th of Kislev, 167, they offer a swine on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem to the god Zeus. And they then begin telling the Jewish people that they can't circumcise their children, no Torah scrolls, no Sabbath, no eating kosher. All outward manifestations of being Jewish or observing the biblical text must be abolished. No one can do it publicly. Remember the saying, they told us that we could not live as Jews here. Then they told us we could not live as Jews. Then they told us we could not live. Yeah. That's the progression. You can't live here as Jews. Then you can't live here. Then you can't live. It increases, it goes in increments. So we had Hellenism that was front and center, and many Jewish people had capitulated to it and had become numbed to the Torah because they enjoyed the niceties of traditional Hellenism. Alexander the Great, when he conquered the then known world, spread Hellenism throughout his conquered territories. And he did more conquering through Hellenism than he did through military activity. Now, the hand that I gave you, take that, and I want to say this as a precursor to what we're about to read. The three primary sources that we have for the discussion of Hanukkah are 1st and 2nd Maccabees and the writings of Josephus. Those are our three primary sources. A later secondary source is the Mishnah in 200 AD. These other sources are prior to that, much closer to the time period in which all these events happen. Okay? That becomes important later on. So, the second paragraph on page 1, I write, around 200 BC, the land of Israel was taken over by the Seleucid dynasty. In 175 BCE, a man by the name of Antiochus assumed the throne of the dynasty and declared himself Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. Behind his back, the Jews punned on his title by calling him Epimanes, the madman. Most of these guys that go like this are mad. They get kind of loopy. After several years, when Antiochus turned his attention toward Israel, and 1 Maccabees 1 records his actions. This is the destruction of the temple part. After Antiochus had defeated Egypt in the year 143, he returned and went up to Jerusalem and up to Israel and to Jerusalem with a strong force. He insolently invaded the sanctuary and took away the golden altar, the lampstand for the light with all its fixtures, the offering table, the cups and the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the golden ornament of the facade of the temple. He stripped off everything and took away the gold and silver and the precious vessels. He also took all the hidden treasures he could find. Taking all of this, he went back to his own country after he had spoken with great arrogance and shed much blood. And there was great mourning for Israel in every place where they dwelt. So he takes all the stuff out of the temple. By the way, this was the way that you demonstrated that your God was greater than the other people's gods, was by raiding the temple. Israel would do the same thing to these other peoples. Other nations did this. We see this all through the Bible. Go into somebody's temple, take all their stuff out, okay, and put it in your temple as a way of saying, our God is greater. You'll remember that they took the Ark of the Covenant and put it in front of Dagon and the Philistines. The Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant, and what happened is Dagon just fell, okay.
Get this thing out of here.
Yeah, and they were like, get this thing out of here. So, by the way, the second earliest representation we have of this kind of looting is in the Arch of Titus, which Titus destroys the temple in 70 AD, the Roman general Titus. And if you look at the Arch of Titus, there is a picture there of them taking out the vessels from the temple. And one of the prominent things that they took out clearly was the menorah. We'll talk about that in a moment. So that's the second earliest representation. Now we have archaeological representation of the menorah. So the Argentitus has a montage of things taken out of the temple at the time of the destruction of the temple. All right. On page 2, top of the page, on the 15th of Kislev in the year 168 BCE, Antiochus converted the temple in Jerusalem into a temple for Zeus. And on 10 days later, on the 25th of Kislev, began offering swine on the altar in honor of Zeus. First Maccabees 1:54-56 reads, "But many in Israel were determined and resolved in their hearts not to eat anything unclean. They preferred to die rather than to be defiled with the unclean food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. Terrible afflictions were upon Israel." Second Maccabees 6:18-31 tells of the aged Eleazar who died because he refused to eat pork, or even to pretend that he was eating pork. Second Maccabees 7 tells the story of Hannah, who watched 7 of her